In this story, I'm going to tell you how I took back my home from a loud, entitled neighbor who trashed my garden, filled my porch with cigarette butts, and ruled the parking lot like it was his. But I didn't call the cops, didn't move out, and didn't start a shouting match. Instead, I set a quiet, legal trap, using his own carelessness against him, moving his tools onto a trailer with a blunt note, and watched his reputation and work life begin to unravel. Stay with me. I'll show you the exact plan, the tense moment he returned, and the unexpected cost of getting even without getting your hands dirty. My name is Evelyn Marlowe. I am 34 and I live in Portland, Oregon. The rain here has always been a kind of benediction for me, that steady wash that makes the world seem honest. I grew up with the smell of wet pavement and cedar trees stitched into my memory, the brittle, comforting scent of a city that knows how to weather storms. I work as a nurse at a small clinic, a job that leaves my feet sore and my hands compassionate in equal measure. It's the sort of work that rewards steadiness and patience, and those qualities have long been the backbone of who I am. When the day allows, I take evening walks along the Willamette, the river's slow current a counterpoint to the small dramas of neighborhood life. I like a garden in a small yard, tomatoes that need coaxing, a basil pot that refuses to be crowned by anything but sunlight. I am careful, persistent, and quietly stubborn. People who know me would say I am reliable to a fault. 2 years ago, I moved into a modest duplex in a quiet neighborhood where renters and homeowners rubbed shoulders in an uneasy truce. I chose the place for the yard and the short commute, for the idea of a front porch and the dignity of tending to something green. On the surface, everything fit the picture I'd painted for myself, but underneath the routine comfort there was one constant irritation. My downstairs neighbor, Ryan. He was the kind of man who compressed the world into his own desires, who believed his convenience outweighed everyone else's peace. At first, the conflict seemed small enough to manage: late-night music, cigarette butts on the landing, plywood left where people walked. But small things accumulated like sediment, layering frustration over shame. Ryan had friends over until 2 in the morning, their laughter tumbling up like an avalanche through my floorboards. He stored lumber and contractor supplies in the shared parking area as if the lot belonged to him alone, sometimes taking 2 spaces and barking at anyone who dared park nearby. I tried to be reasonable. Polite texts, notes slid under his door, calls to the landlord. Each time he would smile like the slight was a joke, promise to be quieter, and then return to louder habits. The landlord, an elderly man who detested confrontation, would mutter that he'd speak to Ryan and then do nothing. The building's indifference felt like betrayal. It taught Ryan that his behavior was tolerable because no one with authority would make it stop. I began keeping a record, dates and times of parties, photographs of cigarette butts and plywood stacked against the walkway, nights when I lay awake counting the thumps through my ceiling. I tried to reason with him directly once or twice, softer at first, then firmer. Each appeal only seemed to encourage him. He would stomp on my floor, laugh loudly in the hall, and once, when I asked him to move a leaning stack of lumber that blocked the emergency exit, he stepped forward with a menacing grin and issued a threat that left my hands trembling. The fear after that call felt different from annoyance. It was intimate and hot, like someone had reached into my life and rearranged its furniture. I could have moved. The rent was reasonable and my savings would have softened the blow. But there was a stubbornness inside me that bristled at the thought. Giving him the satisfaction of driving me out felt like conceding the quiet victory he had been angling toward since day one. I had fought in smaller ways for the right to this little yard, where I coaxed tomatoes through spring frosts and watched seedlings grow into something stubbornly green. The garden represented more than produce. It was a patch of life I tended in a world that often felt battering and indifferent. When he trampled that, I understood the problem had become moral, not just practical. And so the seed of a plan, and the seed of revenge, planted itself in the place between tired resignation and the fierce refusal to be made small. It was not yet a plan of cruelty, but a slow, steady gathering of intent. I would not be run off my porch, my tomatoes, or my life without leaving a mark that said I had been here and I would not be overlooked. After the polite efforts failed, I tried escalation in every sensible way I could think of and failed. I kept a log of the disturbances, took videos of the parties, photographed the plywood and cigarette litter, and turned the evidence into the landlord and to the city's noise complaints office. The landlord promised action, but did nothing. The city sent a form letter about noise regulations and then closed the file because enforcement was stretched thin. I even tried to talk to his friends, the ones who arrived late at night carrying coolers and a laugh that sounded like permission. One of them, a tall woman named Carla, admitted privately that Ryan's behavior was too much, but she said she was afraid of him, especially when he drank. I tried to get the building association involved and discovered there was no association at all, only a tangle of apathetic owners and one manager who would not take a firm stand. The more I tried to hold the line with rules and reasonable requests, the more Ryan took my attempts as proof that I would never go farther. One night I heard him dragging something heavy up the stairs. He was shouting at someone on the phone. Then he let out a laugh that cut through the thin floor of my living room. I was exhausted with worry about whether my tomatoes would get stolen, about parking disputes, about the cigarette butts that kept turning my small patch of yard into a trash patch. I began to lose sleep, which matters when your job requires alertness and calm. My patience started to fray, and small kindnesses began to feel like weakness. In the quiet hours, I started imagining ways to make him uncomfortable enough to stop without breaking the law, but even those ideas felt petty and mean. Then the incident that made everything worse happened. During a particularly loud party, a man stumbled down the stairs and left a beer can that rolled into my open front door, spilling sticky suds across my threshold and into my entry rug. I yelled at him from the hallway, telling him to pick it up, and Ryan came to the doorway, chest puffed, and called me a nosy neighbor in a voice that made the upstairs walls vibrate. He told me to mind my own business, then barged into my yard to yank up a tomato plant by its stem because a neighbor's plant had brushed his truck. Seeing my crushed plant, the thing I had nursed through a stiff spring frost, made something in me snap. The garden was one of the few things I controlled in my life, a small living project I had poured time and quiet into, and he destroyed it like it was nothing. I filed another complaint, and this time the landlord actually called him, resulting in a night of silent fury from Ryan, who muttered threats while I pretended I could not hear. I realized then that my polite attempts had not only failed, they had made the situation personal. I felt smaller in my own home, and the idea of living like that felt intolerable. The stakes had grown from mere annoyance to the erosion of my territory, my peace, and my dignity. I was tired of being the reasonable one, while he took what he wanted. There were smaller moments that had accumulated into this breaking point, details that, in the light of the crushed tomato, felt like a list of minor violences. He would cut across the yard with muddy boots, trailing clumps of soil into the path I swept each morning. His friends treated the stair landing like a porch, leaving chairs and coolers and cigarette butts as if the building was an extension of his bar. Once, on a rainy afternoon, I found a sheet of plywood propped against the side of the house where I stored my herb pots. The wood had scraped the edge of a rosemary bush I had been nursing since a neighbor gave it to me after her husband died. The rosemary survived, but the scrape looked like a tally mark in a ledger of carelessness. I began to catalog these slights in my mind the way I cataloged my evidence: dates, small hurts, indignities. It changed the tenor of my days. Where before I could laugh off a late-night laugh or forgive spilled beer as part of city life, each fresh transgression landed heavier. At work, the strain showed. I would lift a patient and notice the tremor in my hands after a sleepless night. I found myself biting back a sharpness I had not recognized in myself. The politeness that had always been a conscious choice felt worn thin. I started waking at 3 a.m., staring at the ceiling listening for footsteps that might not come, imagining the weight of a toolbox being dragged past my door. In those long hours, fantasies of making him uncomfortable without committing an outright wrong took shape and multiplied. A badly timed lawn sprinkler that soaked his porch at dawn, a subtle rearrangement of his parking so he could not slide lumber out without crawling under a neighbor's car, polite flyers about quiet hours left under his windshield wipers. Each idea felt like a test of my own limits. How far could I push a man who thought me a nuisance before I became the sort of person I had warned myself I would not be? The tomato, my concrete symbol of persistence, became the pivot. I watched the hollow of the ripped stem and imagined the plant's shriveled fruit, all the afternoons of watching small green globes swell into red that now seemed stolen. Anger was not immediate. It rose with the time I had spent trying to be reasonable and with the quiet shame of having been dismissed. When the landlord finally called and Ryan sulked for a night, his muttered threats felt less like bravado and more like confirmation. Escalation bred contempt. I understood, in a sharp, private way, that my attempts to follow the rules had given him the map of my boundaries. If I did nothing else, he would keep drawing on it. Something quiet and stubborn shifted in me. It was not a lust for revenge so much as a refusal to be made small in a place I paid to call home. I remembered my mother's voice telling me to stand my ground, and the image of my tomatoes, tender, resilient, stubborn, became a touchstone. I allowed myself, finally, to think beyond polite notes and formal complaints. Not to break him, not to humiliate for the sake of it, but to make clear that careless entitlement had consequences. That resolve felt like a cool, steady thing. It did not roar, it settled and planned. The line had been crossed. The only question left was how to redraw it so that the next person who treated my home like a playground would see the cost. I decided I had to take a different path, but my first attempts at private action went badly and made things worse. I began by trying to leverage the social pressure I hoped still existed. I printed polite written notices about building rules and posted them in the shared laundry room, expecting neighbors to be quietly annoyed and act. I chose the kind of language I thought would feel neighborly. No accusations, only reminders about quiet hours and respecting shared spaces, hoping to appeal to someone who still cared about common decency. Instead, one of Ryan's friends tore a notice down and left it in the trash, folding the paper so it looked like a joke someone had tossed away. I felt my calmness fray a little more with each ripped poster. I went knocking door to door to ask for support and found only closed doors or people who said they were too busy to get involved. A mother with a stroller mouthed sympathy before pulling her child inside. An elderly man peered through curtains and said he didn't want trouble. The building felt like a small island of indifference. In a moment of fevered frustration, I took a photo of his truck blocking both parking spaces, tires half on the line, plywood spilling into the next bay, and left it on the building manager's desk with a note asking him to ticket obstructive vehicles, hoping that the bureaucracy would finally move. I imagined the manager leafing through the photo and acting, but he folded the note and put it in a pile that never left his desk. The pile grew like quiet evidence of the place's passivity. Ryan escalated in return, as if he had been waiting to see how much I would tolerate. He started playing music through a portable speaker on the landing, so the bass vibrated through my floor no matter what time of night. The rhythm wasn't music to me but a physical thrumming that unstitched the edges of sleep. He left tools near the stairs in the early morning, making the path hazardous, as if the building's routine, my routine, were an inconvenience he could manufacture. I called the police a few times. Officers came, were polite, but then left saying there was insufficient cause to arrest someone or even issue a citation for noise unless it was over a certain decibel level and continuing. Each call to law enforcement seemed to make him bolder because he realized the limit of what authorities would do. The line between nuisance and illegal conduct felt strangely elastic in his hands. Desperation made me try one idea I had sworn I would not. I placed a small sign near his truck that read, in plain black letters, "Please Noyle," then under it no parking in 2 spaces. I thought it would shame him into being better. The sign looked absurd and clumsy in my hand, like a half-formed threat. That night someone spray-painted a crude message across the landing aimed at me and smeared it into the wood by my door. The scent of fresh paint and the sight of those letters carved into my entry made my stomach drop. The landlord blamed me for pushing things too far. He told me softly that confrontation invited trouble. I felt crushed and humiliated. I had been trying to stand up for myself with reasonable actions and ended up provoking petty retaliation. For the first time, I seriously considered moving out because the thought of another night of pounding bass and cigarette butts made my chest tighten. I replayed every attempt, each polite note, every phone call, and the list of failures stretched longer than my patience. The more I lost, the more I realized I had to choose whether to be run off or to make a final stand. My resources were not endless, my energy was fraying, and I felt more alone than I had expected. I could have given up, but as the days grew shorter and his parties louder, I felt something else rising inside me. A careful, cold resolve to make sure he could not keep taking what he wanted without cost. I didn't want revenge for its own sake. I wanted consequence, proportionate and visible, a way to reclaim the small dignities he had eroded. That resolve settled into a plan that would require patience, observation, and more courage than I had used before. I planned my final attempt with a mixture of strategy and quiet fury. I wanted his behavior to stop without me seeming vindictive or violent, and I wanted the consequence to be poetic in a way that fit the offense. I started by collecting evidence again, but this time with patience and cunning. I bought a motion-sensitive outdoor camera for cheap and positioned it so it faced the parking area where he stored lumber and often left his truck. I set it up under the eaves and hid it among an old birdhouse and a hanging fern so it looked like part of the porch. I spent 2 weeks observing from inside during work breaks, watching the feed on my phone. I learned his rhythms, the nights he expected friends, the mornings he returned early after work, the way he dropped a cigarette in the same place and nearly always left his toolbox open. The breakthrough came when I discovered that he often left the back door to his work van unlocked because he used it as a place to crash when the parties got too loud. I switched tactics from public complaints to targeting the thing he valued and feared losing most: his reputation at work and his expensive tools. I found out, through casual conversation at the clinic with a contractor who was a patient of mine, that local contractors valued reliability and tools more than almost anything. Tools lost on a job site meant a reputation damaged and clients lost. I rented a small utility trailer for one night and recruited an unlikely ally. Carla, the woman who had said she felt afraid of Ryan, but also admitted to me once that he was not as tough when someone stood up to him. I told her my plan and she agreed to help because she was tired of watching him ruin the neighborhood. We rehearsed our movements like a quiet play: who would carry which toolbox, where to place the trailer so it was visible but not obstructive, how to keep the tools neat so the prank read as deliberate and not malicious. Our plan was simple and legal. We would move his truck and tools to a place where he would see his own carelessness reflected back at him, but not destroy or steal anything. On a Tuesday morning when he was at work and the building was mostly quiet, Carla and I slipped under the overhang, unlatched the van door, and loaded his most conspicuous toolboxes and a stack of his lumber onto the trailer. We placed a handwritten sign on his truck windshield that read "Tools ON Loan until you learn to lock them," and we left the trailer visible at the entrance of the property, with the tools neatly stacked. We also looped the sign with a short note taped to the toolbox: "Lock your van or lose your jobs." I felt a small adrenaline spike as we worked, but I kept reminding myself we were not ruining him. We were only holding up a mirror. I thought about the nights I had paced my kitchen counting cigarette butts, about the crushed tomato plant and the man's casual cruelty, and about how careful I had been to avoid escalating to something illegal. The memory made my hands steady. That afternoon, I waited on my porch, pretending to water tomatoes, while Carla texted me that Ryan had returned from a job early. He saw the trailer and the tools and flipped between red-faced fury and bewilderment. He began to pace and shout, drawing the attention of neighbors coming home from work. He tried to pull the cover off the trailer, but the community watching made him hesitate. He started accusing me from across the yard, but I stood there steady and quiet, in the same place where his intimidation had once made me shrink. When he stomped to the trailer to inspect the sign, a group of neighbors who had been quietly recording his noise and litter complaints approached and demanded he answer for blocking spaces and leaving his truck in disarray. The building manager, who had previously looked the other way, finally said he would call a towing service if the truck was not moved into compliance. Seeing that his social capital had eroded, Ryan went from bluster to bargaining. He tried to apologize, to promise to be quieter, and to claim he had only been joking. No one believed him. The consequence was exactly what I had aimed for: public accountability instead of a private war. He had to face the people he had disrespected, and his tools, visible and in the open, made him look like the careless contractor he had been. He moved the lumber, started cleaning cigarette butts around his spot, and for the first time I heard him mutter a promise to be quieter. The change was not immediate perfection, but over the following weeks the parties wound down, his truck stopped taking up 2 spaces, and he began to lock his van at night. As for me, the victory felt strange and a little bittersweet. I had not wanted to humiliate him beyond reason, but I wanted him to understand the cost of his behavior. I had taken a risk, and it worked in the way I had hoped. The community saw him as accountable, and he could no longer hide behind loud friends and a landlord who would not act. My tomatoes thrived again under my careful attention, and I slept more nights than I had in months. The building started to show signs of small changes, as other neighbors took their own quiet stands against petty destruction. Today my life in Portland has a new rhythm, gentler and more deliberate than the brittle vigilance that kept me awake for months. I still work at the clinic, and I still take walks along the Willamette, but the duplex feels like mine again in a way it had not for a long time. The nights are quieter, yes, but it's more than silence. It is the small architecture of civility rebuilt. Neighborly nods in the stairwell, the landlord finally replacing the broken bulb by the gate, Carla leaving an extra carton of eggs on my stoop when she knows I worked a double. I do not feel triumphant in a cartoon way. There is no gloating flair or an urge to parade my victory. Instead, I feel steadier, like someone who has learned where patience ends and firm boundaries begin, and how to enforce them without losing herself. Ryan is still sometimes loud when friends come over, but he has changed the rhythm of his noise. He thinks twice before turning the music up to full blast, and more striking to me, he actually helps pick up cigarette butts in the morning when I am out with my coffee. The first time I saw him stoop and bend to pick up a butt near the stairs, I felt a surprising, small pity alongside satisfaction, pity for the lesson learned, gratitude for the air that no longer vibrated with bass. The landlord, likely shamed by the public scene in front of the trailer, started posting clear rules in the laundry room and got quotes for better locks and lighting. He even left a polite, apologetic note in the hallway about enforcement. Carla and I now share a laugh when we meet. We trade stories about the weird things renters do, and sometimes we help each other bring groceries up the stairs. There are evenings when we sit on our stoops with a shared bottle of cheap wine and watch the block go by, ordinary and safe in a way that felt unimaginable months ago. The consequence for Ryan unfolded slowly, and in a strange way, poetically. Months later, a neighbor mentioned over the fence, with a small, satisfied grin, that Ryan had lost a bid for a significant job because a foreman judged him unreliable. The messy van and a reputation for sloppy sights had followed him into an interview. He went to a trade meeting afterward and asked, genuinely, how to secure better work habits. It was not revenge in some ancient, destructive sense of breaking a man. It was a lesson that reverberated into his life so that he reconsidered how he acted around other people. I like to think the moment he read our blunt sign and saw his tools stacked on that trailer was a hinge for him. Small, jangling keys of consequence that opened a door to a different path. My life changed, too. I learned that patience has limits and that community can be built by careful, persistent action rather than by one person trying to do everything alone. I learned to trust my voice in quiet ways, to speak at a meeting, to leave a clear note, to stand on my porch and meet confrontation with calm. Recruiting allies was not a betrayal of independence, but a wiser use of it. The amplified effect of 2 people willing to act matters more than one person shouting into the night. There is a small ritual now when I water my tomatoes. I touch the soil and remember the nights I could not sleep, the mornings I counted cigarette butts like small defeats, and I smile. Not because I hurt someone, but because I stood up and reclaimed a little corner of my life that mattered. That patch of green is proof that sometimes quiet, stubborn insistence does what threats could not, it roots.